So what we're going to do today, Wayne is going to give the presentation, the zoning presentation, Zoning 101 as we called it last week. Before we do that, just a couple things quickly. We may go over the hour, so whether or not we get to the spreadsheet, we'll see how we're doing with questions.
I think it probably makes more sense to spend time in this.
Right. I think we have time. So the other thing is the meeting on the 15th, I think we'll probably have to cancel. Carolyn won't be able to make it. Wayne will probably be at East Hampton for their city council meeting. And two other people won't be here either. So looks like the 15th we'll probably cancel, which means our next meeting will be the first Wednesday in May. And I'll send out emails after this meeting to let everybody know. So you can plan ahead and have the 15th tax day to celebrate it as however you feel necessary to celebrate that day. One of the things we'll do, Wayne will do the presentation, and then also, isn't it a form you can email as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Because what we're going to do, Dylan, who you have maybe not met, Dylan Sussman's setting up a website for us, and we're going to post on his website all the documents that we distribute for public comment, and he's been working with Carolyn to get that set up. So this would be perfect to put on that website.
Files used, I'll probably do it as a PDF instead of PowerPoint.
Yep, that's fine. And then in terms of if we have time, Jim had sent out a question you want to talk about in the minutes. And so what we do, let's carve off at least 15 minutes at the end, just for, or if time allows, we might have more, just for some other general discussions as well. Because there's a couple things on the agenda, we might want to talk about the agenda for the next meeting. I know there's been some discussion for some of the things that have been going around about green initiatives, about parking, so we might want to put those on the agenda for next time. Also, we'll probably have Dylan do a discussion about his website. He's away in Italy this whole month, but when he gets back, we should be able to start taking advantage of his website. So we'll probably want to have him give us a demonstration and then talk to us about how we go about using it. So that's something we can do.
If we could, I could have maybe 5 minutes in the meeting to talk about two zoning things become real important priorities for us.
Sure.
Very quickly.
So let's you want to say till 8:30? We'll put a hard deadline and have a half hour? Okay. All right, then, actually, before we even do that, sorry, Wayne, we added a meeting, at the beginning of each meeting, we have an open public comment session. I'm not sure if either of you guys were here for anything to say.
I am actually.
You are?
I brought public comment.
Okay. So the just name, address, and your comment.
My name is Owen Freeman Daniels. I live on 53 Woodmont Road, Northampton. And I came to speak about my reading of the Sustainable Northampton Plan as it relates to the charge given to the rezoning committee. Over a year ago, I was on a reading group that studied the Sustainable Northampton Plan, and we came out with 5 different tasks that the rezoning committee would be given based on the Sustainable Northampton Plan. And I just would like to, I missed the first meeting, so I wanted to publicly put forth our reading of the Ward 3 Sustainable Northampton Study Group's reading of the Sustainable Northampton Plan as it relates to the rezoning committee. So the first is the one that everyone sees. It's the one that is like the 4th page of the plan where it talks about adopting zoning corresponding to the future land use map contained within the plan. It's extremely vague, and it also neglects to say that the planning board and well, typically the planning board, but certainly the city council actually have to adopt any zoning regulations. But the rezoning committee is supposed to consider the any zoning corresponding to the future land use map of the plan. The second task is actually subtly separate from that, and it's listed separately in the plan when it talks about adopting regulations for use designations corresponding to the future land use map. So the difference being subtle is between any zoning and use zoning. And specifically, it's about maintaining a distinction between rural areas, residential neighborhoods, and urban areas. And so the distinction there being a focus of the rezoning committee, a way to propose zoning that would maintain that distinction. I think that most people see that as the biggest task of the rezoning committee, but there are actually 3 more that are written in the plan. Now, I want to emphasize, though, that all 5 tasks are not solely what the rezoning committee is responsible for. It's one of the many different parts of the city that is going to be dealing with this, but the next 3 are a little bit more arcane. The third is to revise the cluster regulations from the 2003 Grow Smart process. This is also in the plan. The Zoning Revisions Committee is actually specifically charged, along with some other bodies, to review the cluster regulations when it is judged that the cluster ordinance does not provide the optimum designs. That's actual verbiage from the Sustainable Northampton Plan. The next task, the 4th, is for the rezoning committee to consider exclusions and special circumstances when in the course of trying to prevent the loss of commercial and industrial land from becoming residential. It's also in the plan, page 34. The idea is that in the Sustainable Northampton Plan, they want to continue to have commercial and industrial use, and some of that is being converted into residential use. And the rezoning committee, or the Zoning Revisions Committee, one of its tasks is to consider what sort of circumstances might warrant the loss of industrial and commercial space. And the fifth task the rezoning committee was charged with is very, very vague, which is providing options to increase the production of affordable housing. So the point of my public comment is that regardless of who and how this committee was created, the Sustainable Plan itself has the Zoning Revisions Committee with a variety of tasks, and I urge all of its members to take a proactive role in pursuing those tasks, and not to solely be responsible for maybe the first task, which is the consideration of zoning in regards to the future land use map. And I'm done.
Just one of the things we also decided is that during public comment we can actually interact, so we're not going to just let the person speak without interaction. So just a couple things, Owen. And the first one, I think we talked about this at the last meeting. We all recognize that we are not the body that enacts zoning. All that we're going to do is recommend, and the city, even the planning board can't make zoning. It always has to be the city council. And the sustainability plan isn't going to change that. The city council always going to be the one. In terms of a couple of the other ones, cluster regulations is definitely on our list. We went through a list last week, or the first meeting, and cluster regs is one of the big ones that we're going to be discussing for that one. So that, in fact, I think as you mentioned, there was a lot of work done a few years ago as part of, was it sustainable? That's smart growth. Smart growth. Right. There was a lot of work done, so we're going to pick up. That work was actually put on hold during the development of the sustainability plan.
That's so I understand. I mean, I understand that a lot was carried over from the 2003 plan.
Right. So that's going to be a big part of this group as well. In terms of also having a wider scope than just what's in the sustainability plan, we talked about that as well. This committee is going to be empowered to bring things that aren't specifically in the appendix of the sustainability plan, but they can be brought by any member of the committee for us to discuss, as well as the planning board may also be sending things down to us as well. So we will be getting things that aren't right now even in the appendix of that document, but the committee is going to be asked to think of things that are going to be applying also as well.
Well, I'll just say one more thing. Based on my understanding of it, the appendix is considered to be a way in which zoning could fall in line with the future land use map. and the spirit of the sustainable Northampton.
Right. It's
And
not a
maybe
formula.
maybe it's a very good way, but it might not be. And so, given that the committee is charged to try to bring the zoning in line with the sustainable Northampton plan, it may go beyond the scope of the appendix.
Exactly. I think that's what we would, one of the things that I think I imagine all the members would know that what's in that appendix is not all that we're going to be focusing on. We're going to be adding to that appendix as time goes on. So, great.
I appreciate your taking the time.
Sure, no problem.
Cohen, are you reading from
Yes, this
something
was
you guys put
this was
together?
a guide we put together that I can revise and submit if you'd like to.
Want to email it to us? Sure.
Yeah, I would love to.
I mean,
see
Jim
it.
has, you can probably email it to Jim, and Jim can email it to us.
Yeah.
There you go.
And you see the writer.
Thanks, Owen. Did you, I'm sorry, did you have a comment, or were you just here for this? Okay. So Wayne?
Okay, so what I have is an enormous amount of material. We can go to whatever level of detail you want. So this is really sort of everything from the zoning 101 up to sort of talking about specific things in Northampton, specific experiences. So you're going to see lots of words in the slides. Mostly I've recycled these slides from other presentations. I'm not going to have details, but interrupt as we go along so that I'm really just doing the high point to see. I kind of want to know what you're interested in. So I'm going to do a high point. If you want to talk about something in more detail, great. If you don't, then we're just race through the slides. So I'm just going to start by starting quickly, because I know you're all in different places, on sort of the basic constitutional limits to zoning, because that's where we always get challenged, these things, see what they are. So these are the four big things that we worry about primarily at the constitutional level. There's lots of statutory things in terms of Massachusetts, but these are the big limits to what we have. So First Amendment is equivalent to Massachusetts. The big ones, and this sounds really petty, but the big ones where this practically comes up for zoning is about signage and adult uses. You know, in many states it could be about religion as well. Massachusetts basically exempts education institutions and religious institutions from use restrictions. So as a practical matter, you never get constitutional limits. So the big thing is signs. Signs have to be content neutral. We can limit signs, but we can't limit what they say on signs. And adult uses are also basically content neutral. You know, unless something's obscene, we're limiting secondary uses from them. The big one where we probably are most vulnerable to challenges is the Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which is a due process clause, which basically says people have a right to due process. And there's equal protection, which is sort of related to that. We're treating everybody equally. And there's two basic things for due process. The first, which is pretty easy, is what's called procedural due process. That the process is fair. You know, that, I mean, there's laws, for example, about we have to have a meeting in a handicap accessible space. That's defined. But you can imagine we could have a meeting in a handicap accessible space that we properly notice, and the meeting's held at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, there's no law that says we can't hold a meeting at 3 o'clock in the morning, but practically, it's unfair. And so the procedural stuff is really just, is the process fair and above board? And that's pretty simple. We don't so much worry about that. The procedural, the substantive due process is the bigger issue. If any of you ever watched like some law show on television where someone comes to the lawyer, like Boston Legal, with some absurd claim and they go to court, all those, and there's no law that says it, those are all substantive due process claims. And the basic idea of substantive due process is essentially government can't overregulate, it needs to be fair. You know, it has to pass some basic test. And so a lot of challenges, probably most challenges to land use regulations on a constitutional level are substantive due process change, that it goes too far. So, you know, abortion rights is all about substantive due process. That people are saying you're limiting rights too much, preventing abortion, you know, prohibiting abortions. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you have a right to abortion. It's really a substantive due process. So the same thing for zoning. If zoning goes too far, then it's substantive due process.
Meaning if we try to apply zoning that is too restrictive, that could be come up against.
Too restrictive, it's a weighing test, the way the courts do it. So it's a weighing of the regulations that you apply versus the public benefit. So if you have really, really strict regulations, and there's some really good cause for it, you're probably fine. But it's really weighing is how far, how absurd does it get?
I think of, you know, I know people who live in Marblehead, and Marblehead has rules about the color you can paint your house because it's a historic district. That is considered, that's fine, because, but if you try to do that in Northampton, I imagine that would be a problem.
Yeah, that would be a substantive due process claim. The classic one is, how much are you devaluing someone's property? If you're devaluing the property really dramatically, it's potentially a substantive due process claim. Because, you know, limiting the color, it may be annoying to an owner, but it's not really a financial cost if you're doing it. But if you say, yes, you can have one house with 1,000 acres, that might really be going too far.
I,
So,
Sorry.
I think you go
Sorry.
Bruce, it's not your fault.
I was here and then I went to Jackson and came back.
There you go.
So how is Jackson Street tonight?
Very empty.
Bruce came to apologize.
I
I think I sent him to the wrong place.
We just got started on waiting for the next thing.
The cell phone always dies at the wonderful,
Oh.
wonderful place.
I called Catherine to get your cell phone number, then called
that
you
was
to get your
nice.
voicemail.
Thank you.
When you used the Boston legal example, my mind immediately went to those things usually get hung up on some technicality in the law, whereas what it sounds like you're describing, actually looking at the zoning issue as compared, when you did the Boston legal, and I guess I'm being critical of that, but my mind kind of went off when you talking about due process, the process for the process sake, not for the
So this would be
zoning.
right. So this is the procedural due process.
Yeah.
Did you go through the right step? But the substantive
Okay.
due process is this thing. You know,
I get it, okay.
if you're going too far, the unduly repressive. You know, this is the three-part test that courts typically use.
Okay, so there's both. There's
Right. So
substantive and
procedural.
procedural.
So procedural is, say, the easier part, and frankly, that's typically what staff does. And we notice the meeting's the right way. Do we
Yeah,
make sure
yeah.
you're not meeting at midnight and those
I
sort of
get it.
things. So this is the classic three-part test for procedural due process. I'm going to tell you all heard the term takings, which is a political term for takings, a legal term. We'll talk in a second. But procedural due process, substantive due process is actually a bigger issue in terms of potential challenges. Just one point to get to takings in a second, but to remember is, from a public standpoint, from the city's standpoint, we always want to follow the rules, and we don't ever want zoning thrown out. But the consequence of losing on the substantive due process claim is the zoning gets thrown out. There's no damage against the city. There's this other thing about takings, which is really hard for a litigant to prove, but if they do it, you actually could pay financial damages. So procedural stuff is really, it's basically all about just thinking about what's the reason we're doing this.
So if we're talking, we're talking about a sustainability plan. A lot of the point of the plan
Yeah.
is that we need to do major changes in our society from a global level down to a local level. Is there a potential that some things we may come up with may be seen as kind of in conflict of this? You know, not legitimate public purpose as business as usual. You know, as things have been going on for the last 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, the big issue, to say the sustainability plan talks about preserving the outlying areas, you can't do that totally by regulations. People have some property rights, and so some of that, we're buying land aggressively because we can't limit the land too much. And so some of that that's really about is.
But kind of deciding what a structure might look like somewhere.
That'd be pretty easy, as long as that's clear. That in some ways would be more procedural due process. That you need to be clear, if you said every building has to be approved by some design committee, and the design committee is not going to have a charge, just going to look at the building and see if they like the building or not.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a procedural violation. But if you had a well-reasoned ordinance
Some
on
energy
what buildings
standards or
look like,
something.
right, those would all be
Yeah.
fine. We have some procedural issues. The energy standards are typically written by the state in the building code, but those would all be fine. So we've never had a challenge here, but most zoning gets challenged in other communities is based on this. So it's the limits of how far can you go. I won't go through this, but the substantive process is the big stuff, the stuff that you just shocks the conscience. So having design standards doesn't shock the conscience. Saying that someone who spends $1 million on a piece of property can get a $50,000 return might well be something that would cross the line. I won't go through this, but again, sort of the procedural side and the substantive side. Equal protection, again, doesn't come up very often for us, but this is sort of a cousin of due process. It's basically we have to treat everybody the same. And equal protection, people think in terms of racial discrimination. So, because it's come up a lot, if there's classes of people who are traditionally discriminated against, this is called a strict scrutiny standard. So if you have zoning which has the effect of discriminating against African Americans or Asian Americans, whatever else it is, then the courts are dubious. And the courts say, I want to look at the zoning really, really carefully. If you have zoning which discriminates against somebody who is not the suspect class, then the courts will give you all due deference. So that is, they're more likely to defer to what you do. And there may be a consequence that, you know, limiting chickens in a neighborhood may have the effect of prohibiting some ethnic group who's really used to having pot-bellied pigs. You know, it may have an effect, but people with pot-bellied pigs aren't a suspect class. We're not traditionally discriminating against them, so we don't worry about that. So it doesn't come up very often. It comes up in some states and not this state about affordable housing. So some states, New Jersey in particular, and New York to a lesser extent, have said if your zoning prohibits people from being able to build new homes because it makes it too expensive, that they're going to throw that out and say it's restricted. That's not a problem in Northampton. So for the most part, equal protection isn't a real challenge for us. But there's a sort of thing related to equal protection, which is one of the basic rules for zoning, is you create zoning districts. And you can have one zoning district for a town, which lots of hill towns do, or 20 zoning districts, Northampton does, or 100 districts, and I'm sure some communities do. And you can have as many as you want, but within each district you have to have equal rules. So you have to be careful on an equal application of what those rules are within. So I'm going to run through this adult uses I talked about briefly before. These are really just here in case people have questions. This one's interesting because people have tried to say equal protection, that I'm being discriminated against. And so I'm going to go to federal court and say, because you turned down my project, I'm being discriminated against. And so this is a recent case where the court laughed at them and said, you know, equal protection is about a whole class of people being discriminated against. The fact that the zoning board approved one application and denied a different application isn't a constitutional violation of equal process. I mention this only because the original Supreme Court case about zoning in 1926, this was basically what it all came down to, was equal protection. The Supreme Court was about to throw out Euclid, Ohio's zoning regulations because Euclid had horrible zoning regulations and didn't make any sense, and the court looked at them and thought they should throw them out, and then basically said, changed them based on amicus curiae brief, changed it to say, the question before us really is zoning on its face unconstitutional? And the Supreme Court said, no, zoning is unconstitutional, it's fine, and that was sort of the birth of zoning. And to mention this in passing, because this is sort of the double entendre. People talk about zoning as being Euclidean zoning, and they think about Euclidean as being the father of geometry, and it's really named after Euclid. The double entendre is the basic rule for zoning is you have these zoning districts that are a polygon, and you have consistent rules within those polygons.
Zoning humor.
Yeah,
Let's remember that, we'll need it.
You never know when at a cocktail party.
This is also the case that called apartment buildings near parasites. And said it's fine to be in apartment buildings because they're parasites and everything else. So the Fifth Amendment I went through before because that's the basis for due process. The Fifth Amendment actually has two things that affect zoning. So one is this due process that's right here that I mentioned. You know, you can't do anything without due process. And so that's called the Due Process Clause. Again, for those of you who remember your constitutional law, your civics, Fifth Amendment only affected what the federal government did, didn't affect what state governments did. The 14th Amendment after the Civil War extended the protection of the Constitution to state governments. So when the Constitution was passed, state governments could deprive people of all these things. And the federal government could after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment extended. So that's why we talk about a lot of these things being the 5th and 14th Amendment, because that's what we're spread out. So the due process law is the basic thing that says you have to be fair. The taking clause, which people talk about more, says you can't take property for public use without just compensation. So when people think of this as eminent domain, the city comes in and take land for a bike path, which I'm working on. The city has the right to do that. We just have to pay what the property is worth. But this was called regulatory taking as well. If the regulations go too far, then that's considered a taking, and And a series of cases starting in 1922, going on until 2 years ago, sort of defining what those things are. And basically it's really hard to have a taking. So whereas people always talk about takings and say if you pass these regulations it's a taking, it may be a political taking. And maybe they go before the councilors and say these regulations are really horrible. But it's pretty rare that it's actually a regulatory taking.
But don't you mean when the deputy said if you made the rule that the minimum lot size is 1,000 acres, that's not considered a taking because...
That might be a taking if you went that far. But
Right.
I want to make a distinction because, again, from a legal standpoint, if you violate due process, your zoning still gets thrown out, but the financial consequences are a lot less.
Right.
So the question is, how far would you go before at a certain point you become a due process violation, at a point much further than that you become a taking. We don't want to break the law anyway and lose our zoning, but you worry more about sort of what the consequences are afterwards. So, as I say, this goes back to this 1922 case on how far can regulations go. There's a series of cases. I like this one. I like this one only in terms of saying there's never been pure property rights. So the original charter for Massachusetts, the king reserved the right to take a mast for ships on common land, not on private land, but on common land. So, from when this colony was formed, there was never sort of ultimate total rights. But so there's this case in Hawaii a couple of years ago, and the basic premise of the case was Hawaii has a limited number of gas stations. Really exciting subject. And Hawaii was worried there wasn't enough competition between gas stations. And so they were limiting gas station companies, Mobil and the big companies, as to how much they could charge for rent for the gas stations, individual operators, because that was making the price go really high. And actually, Connecticut's looked into doing the same thing. Because Connecticut was also worried that gas prices were too high, and the gas prices were too high because there were too few gas stations. So Hawaii passed this law. It was challenged by the gas station companies who said it was an unconstitutional taking. Long story short, after 80 years, the Supreme Court trying to figure out what taking is, they finally sort of came up with this four-part test that I won't go through, but I guess I will go through. But so there's 4 parts of a taking, and so generally we don't violate those. The first, which is a really easy no-no, and we always hear people want us to violate this, is a trespass. So if we take an inch of private property, no matter how minuscule it is, then that's a taking. And we have to pay just compensation. Now, often just compensation is $1, but we have to pay just compensation.
We're not saying like a right of way across it, like, you have to cross some field to get to something else. Is that?
That would be a taking. Now, the funny thing is, all the cases where people lose, they're mostly regulations that aren't that well thought out. So I give you an example. One of the classic cases was the Dolan case in Oregon, where town said, sounds familiar because we've done this, town said, we want a bike path across your property because we want to mitigate your traffic impacts. And Dolan said, no, I don't want to give you a bike path, and went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with Dolan that would be a taking, and they should pay. So you can't do that. For Walgreens, which is under construction, we said, we want to mitigate your traffic. We're looking at traffic on King Street, and we look at how much it would cost to mitigate that traffic, and we think that would cost about $100,000 to mitigate it. And you can mitigate it, incidentally, one of the ways we'd happily have you mitigate it is put a bike path through your property. Sounds just like Dolan, but we didn't require it. So Stop and Shop across the street and Walgreens this year both voluntarily gave us a bike path. Both had major incentives, and big incentives since that got them to the table, but they didn't have to do it. They could have said no. So you can often get to the same place. That's what the planning board's done in a lot of cases where, and we've built this into the zoning, there's that cluster thing that I hope you all revisit. We built out zoning where we say, you can do the open space in cluster right now can't be steeper than I think it's 8%. But by incentive, if you allow public access onto the open space, we're going to let the slopes go up to 20%. So you can have somebody voluntarily give you stuff, and that's absolutely fine. But you can't mandate it. So the trespass is an automatic no-no unless it's voluntary.
But you could write zoning that says you could take that. So the zoning doesn't require the bike path, but the zoning could be written such that you'll take that as a way to mitigate traffic.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. So that's why the traffic mitigation thing is technically a voluntary fit. You know, so downtown, for example, if you build a building, you have to provide a parking spot, enough parking for the building. Or you can pay a payment in lieu of parking, it's $2,000 a space. So some people want parking because the new building on Strong Avenue sold their garages for $50,000 each. So they made a decision. But it costs more than $2,000 to create a parking spot. So unless a property owner does it, they're going to say, please, can you give me this money? That's absolutely legitimate. The second one that, again, doesn't come up very often is if you deprive a property owner of all use of the property. This isn't necessarily 1 house per 1,000 acres. This is really saying this property you have is totally worthless. Now, that property might be 2 acres, or it might be 1,000 acres, but you can't take all the value away from the property. And the issue that always comes up for this stuff is the next one. So the issue that always comes up for this is number 3, is what's the denominator? You know, if I have a 100-acre parcel I can't develop at all, that's, you know, that would be taken. But what if I have a 100-acre parcel and I sell 98 acres? And then I say, okay, I have 2 acres. It happens to be all wetlands and underwater. You can't turn me down, that would be a taking. And the courts will say, no, the denominator is the 100 acres of property, not the, not that you create your own hardship. And so this third one is the one that's least clear sometimes, and it's always a weighing issue that's there.
Could you just go back now?
Yeah. I think.
What? The investment-backed expectations. So in other words, it encourages an economic look at the property. What's the value of the property?
So if I find
to an investor before any
Right.
regulation was imposed, and what is it afterwards?
That's right. If I go out and buy one of the biggest potentially developable parcels in Northampton is the area near the pistol range, near the Ryan Road School. If I went out and bought, I don't know how much land is there, but 100 acres of relatively flat land. If I went out and bought it, and then the zoning, and I did a good full faith analysis and ran pro formas and said, I think I can do 100 homes here, and 100 homes is worth, a year ago, God knows what the market is now, but the raw land is worth $30,000 an acre, or $30,000 a unit, and so I'm going to buy this land based on that. And then suddenly the zoning comes in, and I can do 1 home on my 100 acres. I did a reasonable investment-backed decision, and I bought the land based on a good faith analysis, and then the zoning changed. That would be taken. But if I go out in the meadows of Northampton and I buy 1,000 acres of land in the floodplain, that we haven't allowed a house in the floodplain with one exception in 30 years. And we have zoning that clearly says you can't build in the floodplain, and we have all sorts of regulations. The court's going to say tough. And so this is sort of a test that goes through is, do you look at it rationally and even if you make the investment-based decision, it's still weighing. It doesn't mean the zoning can't dramatically downside the property. That's why I say the regulatory takings, if we're careful and we're as careful, don't really come up. Aren't legitimate issues, although every time the zoning gets tougher, people would say it's a taking. And so I always go to council and say it may be a political taking that maybe they view. Councilors may feel like the zoning is going too far, and that's fine. But that's a political issue as opposed to a legal issue. So the fourth one here is, this is sort of the weighing piece again. The first thing is weighing the cost of the regulations versus the value of the land. The second one is weighing how much we're asking for people for what's the public benefit. So this goes back to traffic mitigation. We ask for traffic mitigation. We have this whole formula. We get roughly $2,000 per afternoon peak trip hour. We can easily run numbers and say, a new afternoon trip hour is going to cost us $2,000 or $3,000. And so we can make that description. But if we had a regulation where we expected $10,000 per afternoon peak trip hour, we couldn't really make that connection. So that goes back to, we'd be going too far for this. So what the Lingo case said is there used to be a fifth one. So all these cases over the last 80 years had a fifth one, which was the public purpose. Was there an adequate public purpose? And what the Lingo case said is, at least as far as takings, public purpose doesn't matter. That's what democracy is all about, throwing out the bastards. If city council has some really horrible zoning, doesn't make sense. Use your design standards. If we say all new buildings have to be pink, and we're not going to allow any building in Northampton that's not pink, that's not a taking, because the property still has value. It may be a really stupid regulation, and the voters should probably throw out all the councils in the next election, but it's not a taking, and so it wouldn't be a taking it might still be a due process claim. So a lot of the issue is, what Lingle said is, a lot of stuff isn't taking, it may still be due process. So that's what this is about. Okay, that quick and dirty version, right?
Constitutional law.
Constitutional law. Okay. I just want to note that the last one, regulatory takings, then we're done with Constitution. This is really interesting because Chatham banned, we actually followed Chatham. This is an important case for Northampton. Chatham in sometime before 2005, I'm not sure when, banned floodplain construction. And they were challenged as a taking claim. And Chatham did a really interesting thing. Usually state courts apply state constitution. And Massachusetts has been pretty liberal about their interpreting state constitution. But the court in this case, the appeals court, said, we're actually going to follow the U.S. Constitution because we want to send a clear message that we think the U.S. Constitution allows what Chatham did. And this has been great, but the appeals court turned the decision down 3 weeks before Katrina. And the decision probably was unpopular at the time, and 3 weeks later it seemed like brilliant hindsight. SJC upheld it. And basically they said what Chatham did was fine. That yes, they're really dramatically devaluing the property of land, but in this case is a very strong environmental reason for doing it. And so it was based on this that we went to council a year later and began the process of dramatically downzoning the floodplain in Northampton. Because, we felt like we had less exposure to losses. I'm not trying to give you my own agenda, but one of the challenges I'm going to give you as we go through is we did this process for the whole Connecticut River floodplain. We didn't do it for the other floodplains in town. Now it's an issue in particular because some of those other properties are on the market right now. 2 properties in the floodplain elsewhere in town, but it's going to be an issue in other places. And so I personally would love us to look at all the floodplains in town and think about the same thing. There's no particular reason why Connecticut River should be treated differently than the rest of the floodplain. It's treated differently because it's 3,000 acres in one area, and everywhere else in town you have these relatively thin corridors.
So that just limits new development, but grandfathers the existing? Or
Right, and so
what if there's a major renovation?
Right, so we did that. It was sort of that's what made it work. The Ward 3 people were really helpful in the process. But what we did in the floodplain of Connecticut River is we actually went in both directions. We liberalized the rules we had one set of rules before. We basically liberalized the rules for existing uses and structures. So if you have a house or if you have a commercial building, it's easier to expand it today than it was 5 years ago. But if you want to build a new house, it basically is impossible. So that was really the idea. Is the people were there are there. It doesn't make sense to make them tear down, and we want them to invest in their properties. And so most of the people benefited from the rules change. And the reality is it's hard to regulate anyway. So it seemed like there's a certain fairness for that. All right, so I talked about it, you clearly done before, but again, the basic rules for zoning, you could regulate anything in the district. You can regulate uses, you can regulate dimensions, you can regulate operations, you can regulate appearance, you can regulate performance. Performance is a big thing of how noisy is it. Zoning can be sort of, it's called prescriptive, it's a cookbook. It tells you how far from a property line your building can be and how tall it can be. Or it can be performance, it tells you how your operation performs. Or, like most zoning, it could be a mixture of the two. So we're prescriptive in terms of setback requirements.
When you say performance, you mean building performance?
No.
No, function of that business.
Let me give you an example. Sound, for example.
Okay.
We say the way we're going to regulate sound is how noisy is your property at the property line. You could buy a rooftop mechanical that's really quiet. Or you could buy a rooftop mechanical that's really noisy and put shielding up behind it. Or a rooftop mechanical that's really noisy and have the building far from the property line. We got the owner figured out how they want to do it. What we say is, I want to hang out the sound meter on your property line and be below X level.
So in that case, it's performance of building components.
Building, or a sound thing in particular,
Sound,
emissions, right?
how it affects your neighbors.
Let me go back, because so you know about the building. This was in shared out Massachusetts and some states, but Massachusetts, as you know, is 351 cities and towns, so lots of different jurisdictions for a relatively small state. And it used to be that every town could do their own building code, and so you had these it was horrible for builders, because you had all these different building codes. And so Massachusetts went through this big reform 30 years ago, some long time ago, and so we're going to have a statewide building code. There's some local options. There's this energy stretch code being proposed now that would have local options you sign into or not, but basically the state does the building code. And then a few years later they said, oh great, communities are figuring out a way around this. They're squeezing building code type stuff into zoning. And so Massachusetts, they can't do that. Building code is really a state jurisdiction. So we can't regulate building performance, we can't do all the things that building codes do.
Except the stretch codes.
Right, that's a local option. It would still be a Massachusetts code. There's a historic code, there's local options, there's the energy stretch code. But Massachusetts will still write the code. Towns can accept or not accept. But it wouldn't be something that's written by this is similar to that voluntary payment in lieu of thing. You can't mandate a building performance. You can't mandate a building have an extra 12 inches of insulation unless you did stretch code. But you certainly can give incentives. So, we've talked about if we want to encourage green roofs. We can't require green roofs, but we do have a maximum percentage of impervious surface. You could do, and some communities have done this, to say a green roof, or pervious pavement for that matter, counts as if it was virgin land. And a solid roof, so you have ways to get around that. You can always do it by incentives. You could say, we're going to let buildings be twice as tall if they're LEED certified. So you have lots of ways to get to some of the same goals. Both Cambridge and one of the suburbs that begins with an A, I can't remember which one, now a process where they require people to go through the LEED certification process, at least as an exercise.
And that's not unconstitutional.
As an exercise, it's fine. I don't, Boston is requiring LEED certification for buildings above a certain size.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, there's a zoning act for 350 cities and towns, and there's a separate zoning act for Boston. So I don't know enough about Boston because they have their own act, and it may be some exception, but.
Right, yeah, because I've seen model bylaws that I believe are for Massachusetts, but maybe we've developed them at PVPC or at the state that have basically said above a certain percentage, you need to meet the LEED criteria or become LEED certified, which does seem to be encroaching upon the state building code.
But, although the argument for LEED, which you might make, is it's funny what the rules are. If you said you want buildings to have an extra inch thick wall, with the insulation, that's clearly telling you how to get to the goal, and I would think that's clearly a violation. But LEED, you can have a pretty bad building. The story I tell about the senior center, which I love as a senior center, but when we did value engineering for the senior center, because it was too high, we really wanted to stay LEED certified. We actually lost some insulation because we couldn't afford the insulation. So, you can lose some insulation and still be LEED certified, so overall it's a great building, gets lots of points.
I think on that point, there's one more step that's separate from material and some certain certification. That's performance in essence. So you rate air exchanges or something that's not tied to a certain installation measure or building component. So you can say, new building has to have certain air exchanges, and that is performance, but not tied to some specific point list or something.
It would really depend. See, I don't know the building code well enough. To the extent the building, the term of this stuff is often covers the field. To the extent the building code talks about air exchanges, then that's messing on their turf. To the extent the building code doesn't talk about air exchanges, that would be fine. I don't know the answer about the building code. So to the extent they cover that area. This goes through we do this all the time. So like zoning, for example, can't regulate materials.
Right.
But other ordinances and bylaws can. So that's one reason we have historic districts and we have a central business architecture district, is we can do things through those we can't do through zoning. And you guys obviously are primarily focused on zoning, but you need to think about the bigger picture, not to pick on poor Smith, but we have some regulations that are deliberately not done through zoning because Smith is exempt from a lot of zoning regulations, but they're not exempt from those other regulations. And so that comes into play too.
Wait, what do you mean by, I've never heard the term stretch? Stretch?
So this is a new thing. This is the Green Communities Act that you mentioned before. So Massachusetts come up with a new building code that is to really be much stricter in energy. It's going to be a voluntary code, and it's voluntary for each community. So cities and towns, their legislative body can say we accept this new code, or we don't accept the new code. We're not writing it. New code's supposed to be done in May or June, and so we'll go to council.
So there are two possibilities, energy and was it?
There's also historic code, and I think that's a local option as well. Again, I'm not a building
I
person.
sent something around from Chris Mason. It has a bit about the state stretch code and then how Northampton ties into it. So it's in the PDF I sent.
Okay.
They came out with a draft code in early March. Comments are open till August 17th, I think, is Brian's email. And then they go forward. And so the city's position through this Energy and Sustainability Committee, who knows what council will do, but this Energy and Sustainability Committee thinks it's a great ordinance, we hope council adopts it, with some specific comments, most of which came from our building inspector, who noticed that stuff.
But the city has to either take the whole thing or reject it.
That's correct.
There's no.
That's correct. And I believe we did the same thing for this historic code. Historic code is basically less strict. You know, I have a friend who used to be commissioner of labor in Vermont, and at one point she looked at the state capitol, which is a beautiful wood frame state capitol. She said, you know, by the building code, the entire entry corridor, the entire entry stairwell should be enclosed with sprinklers. And got Vermont to do a historic code because no one really wanted the entire Capitol Rotunda to be divided up. And so that's why this historic code to say, we make some compromise for fire safety to preserve historic code. I'm not going to go through this, but no, you know, courts have been pretty, this is not something I would advocate, but courts are pretty sympathetic. The Supreme Court had this case where they said how wonderful single-family home districts are, and we totally understand that, you know, multi-family homes are horrible, and so we're going to uphold single-family home districts. This is pretty exclusionary from my standpoint, but
The URA was single-family home.
URA single-family home, yeah, some exceptions. But so Supreme Court said that kind of stuff is fine. A lot of these exclusionary housing cases about affordable housing come in if you're a town that only allowed, if we were a town of rural residential in every inch in town, someone could say we have the effect of keeping out poor people. But to have some areas in town that effectively keep out poor people, if you're allowing them elsewhere, is an exclusion. Plus Massachusetts courts are particularly strict about that. So you already talked about this, zoning be prescriptive, that's the clear set of standards, or it can be performance. They say most zoning is a hybrid, but you know, some communities are more on the performance-based side of things. You know, for traffic mitigation, we're more performance-based. We can do a lot of flexibility to it. For setback requirements, we tend to be more prescriptive. So I think you asked, but I'm going to answer this quickly. So,
Is that Mainsfield?
yes, that's Mansfield after the flood.
Yes.
The river's trying to reestablish itself where it is. And you can see this slide. The reason we did this slide, I like this slide, is they had all this flood damage, and you went out and you could see exactly where the fences were. Even these little fences blocked the flow of water enough that basically wherever there was dirt and wherever there was an opening the fence, it was washed away. Where there's big fields, the field did just fine with the floods.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be a prescriptive approach. So rather than, you know, prescriptive approach might be saying, you know, plan your field in the floodplain. Plan it so it's hardened against the flood, and there's lots of ways to do it. You could plant grass in this case. We end up doing is having breakaway fences. So the next time a flood comes, the fence opens like a hinge and the water flows through and hopefully doesn't have the same problems. With
So that's not the flood from 4 years ago or so.
Right.
Is this Floyd? When was Floyd?
It was something like that 3-4 years ago.
3-4 years ago. Well, the
Oh,
hinge
more.
fences were in,
Yeah, this
and
Floyd was earlier.
and they worked.
Yeah, this is from Floyd. It was earlier that did more
Yeah,
damage.
it was a number of years before that.
Yeah.
Huh.
Oh, so that's older.
So generally zoning can limit uses in a lot of different ways. One is it can say, these uses are allowed by right. You don't have to go before any board. You just have to go before the building inspector. You don't have to go before any board. You still have to meet all the standards. And to the extent we can have clear, measurable standards that don't require discretion, this is good. One of the pitches I'll make later today is, you know, we're going to be losing staff, planning office is going to be losing staff, and the layoff's coming. And we're looking clearly at, if we staff everything a little less, we're going to do a bad job at everything. And so one of the challenges for all you is, what are the things that we shouldn't be using our resources on, that we can clearly measure and say, you know, let's say how we do this. We want a clear set of standards that the building commissioner can, or staff, whoever it is, can do, and let those go out so we can spend the effort on the things which we really should be looking at. We just did one recently with the planning board and city council, where we looked at a standard for where driveways on a main street versus a side street. And we said, look, these come to the planning board twice a year, not often. Planning board always does the same thing. We can put that in standards, not make someone pay $200, not make someone take a few hours of staff time and wait a month to go before the board. We can move it to the as of right piece. So the more we can do that, the more we know exactly what the outcome is being. We've been aggressive. We've done this a lot in the last 10 years. We've moved a lot of uses from discretionary to as of right, that I think for the most part successfully and not controversial. You have to look at them really carefully, but you know, again, allows us to focus on the project more important. So that's one kind of use. The second use is uses that are allowed by site plan. These are, we have a threshold in Northampton, any project that's 2,000 square feet or more of construction, that's the one that hits projects, other than single family homes and two families. That's the one that hits site plan most often. We have some other thresholds. I think it requires 5 new parking spaces, any drive-ins of a certain kind. But the 2,000 square feet or more is the one that comes in most often. And that means the project has to come before the planning board. And so the planning board looks at the detail. But the planning board ultimately has to approve the project. There's no ability to say, this is a bad project. What there is ability is to totally change how the project faces the public realm. So these are the issues where we care about landscaping, and we care about traffic safety on site, traffic safety off site, and we care about aesthetics and design, all those kinds of things. Site plan scares off some people, and it adds a cost to a project. But since most people get ultimately getting a permit, we don't think we lose many projects. That is, we don't have many investors to say, I'm not going to go down this path because it's too risky. So site plan is not quite as good as it has a right from an investment standpoint, but it preserves what most people care about. The next level is special permit. Special permit is discretionary. It's supposed to be standards. It's not, the board can't be arbitrary and capricious, but at least the board can have a clear set of standards. This is the one that, on the one hand, is really appealing. The boards all love us because you can say yes, you can say no. Neighbors really like it because you can say no. The flip side is if you ask any developer in town or any developer's attorney in town, they're going to say the first thing they do when a client comes before them is they look at the zoning and they look at is there a use they can do on the property that doesn't require a special permit. Because the cost of going through a special, this could be a year process and goes to court, it could be a 5-year process. We have more projects that get special permits and go to court and never get built, even though the court case was totally groundless. Because 2-year delay kills most projects. And so special permits we look at really rarely. The reason we always have to re-examine this is until 21 years ago, I know 21 years sounds like a long time, but we didn't have site plan approval. So lots of uses that could be bad required site plan approval. Then we adopted site plan approval. We've then spent the last 20 years allowing more and more uses by site plan approval only. On King Street, for example, people almost never care about what the use is. They care about the traffic, they care about the landscape. So I'm not, in downtown the same thing. With the exception actually of the hotel, I'm not sure we've ever had someone complain about use downtown. They complain about how it faces the street. And so there's more of those things I think that are there that we should be getting rid of special permits and moving to site plan approval. And don't get me wrong, the site plan can be very, very strict and probably should be beefed up in some ways. So this becomes a big thing as you look through the ordinance and think about what are the opportunities and what are the challenges. So zoning creates districts, I talked about before, but just so you know this, you can create, I mentioned you can create districts, you can also create overlay districts. So basically in a district, you have another district on top of that district, and another district on top of that district, and another one on top of that one. So the basic rules are zoning, the basic districts, the underlying districts, create a basic set of rules. What uses are allowed where, what dimensional standards are allowed. And then you can put overlays in, and overlays can be stricter or less strict. So for example, you could have a floodplain overlay that has an extra set of regulations because you're in a floodplain, and that gets stricter. Or you could have a downtown commercial overlay that provides bonus incentives. So we have both directions. We have a watershed protection, which is a floodplain overlay, and we have a residential incentive overlay, which says if you provide affordable housing within this district, and a third of the units are affordable housing, then you get a bump up onto 3 zoning districts. So the land is the SRRR. We say in this area, if you do affordable housing, we're going to treat it as if it's your bit. It's a much denser district. So overlays can go in both directions. They also are sometimes more complicated, and so I'm an advocate for actually doing overlays where we have to, but getting rid of them where they can. So that goes back to Special Conservancy, which is the floodplain along the Connecticut River, is a floodplain. That's the underlying district. Watershed is this floodplain district we have along every other river in town, and it's superimposed on the underlying zoning districts. So it gets confusing. And I guess my feeling is, in watershed protection, if we don't want to allow housing, we shouldn't have this one district that says housing can come, and a separate section of zoning ordinance that says housing can't come. zoning is always going to be complex. There's no reason to make it complex and having two different sections in the same book that say two different things. And there's a clear, the zoning says, if you look in the right places, this one's on top of that one. So from a legal standpoint, it's fine, but it adds confusion needlessly. I'd rather use confusion where you have to instead of needlessly.
So you think in Northampton, would you say there's 21 or 20?
I think it's 14 underlying districts. I'm going to go through them all quickly.
Okay.
I believe it's 14 underlying and 7 overlays. I'll run through them all quickly. Okay, so again, you can be as creative or not creative as you want to be. This is the sorts of things we do in site plan approval. We could also do it by right. So that, you could have lighting, for example. We used to give the planning board a lot more discretion. And then we wrote the old lighting ordinance said, no excessive glare. Now the new lighting says, you shouldn't be able to see the filament of the lamp, and here's exactly what the amount of foot candles you can have for the project, and so it's much clearer. And so the building inspector spent $150 on a light meter, and we all now have a standard of what that stuff is. And so the clearer the standards are, it means two things. The regulated public likes it because they know what the rules are, and the building inspector likes it because he couldn't go to court. But it said no excessive glare. It's hard to go to court with it. When you say no lighting above X foot candles, it's pretty easy to go to court. If a light meter, you take a picture of the light meter, you go to court and say, look, there's a violation.
What happened to New York and Pennsylvania?
Yeah, what happened?
This was the blackout of 5 years ago.
Really?
Oh,
Great picture.
It's a good picture.
I thought you photoshopped it or something to show what we could do.
Remember we were like right on the edge and our camp was on.
Global
It was-
warming.
yeah.
It's the flood.
Wow.
Wow.
Now I'm beginning to sort of transition to things that Northampton does, just to give you examples. This is by no means exclusive. You know the sorts of things we've done. So we've been, part of my job has been buying open space from the city. We buy between about 100 acres, 150 acres a year. And so we've put incentives in the zoning to encourage that. So we have cluster regulations, which are very buggy, but are a lot better than the non-cluster regulations that encourage open space donations. We have provisions where if somebody gives us property, they get credit for the property. We pitched this actually to the property I tried to buy, the Wireworks.
Wow, nice.
The Wireworks owns all their property back there. So he needs that land because it meets his zoning requirements. We provision zoning where he can give us the land, but it's yours forever for zoning purposes. So if the only reason you're owning land and won't give it to us for open space is you need it for zoning, then someone can go ahead and give us land. So we've had a fair number of land donations based on that. We have incentives for affordable housing. It's interesting, a lot of these incentives, we do some limited development projects. And so a lot of incentives we're the ones who take advantage of. So we bought land which we couldn't quite afford. We carved out a couple of building lots to preserve the back land. But the incentives are there. So there's two messages there. One, we have a lot of incentives that work because we've done about one project a year for the last 6 years, and it's dramatically lower the cost of open space. But the other is, I will say, having done this for a long time, the private sector doesn't usually take advantage of these things. They can't be bothered with it. And so one of the problems with creative approaches is most developers don't want to do it.
You said, Wayne, the city buys, I forget you said open space, wherever possible or something like that.
Whatever makes sense.
What is the reasoning behind it?
Two things, I think, three things. One is to preserve land for from wildlife standpoint, and ecological reasons. One is to preserve land for recreation, which is a lot less. We've done some recreation purchases. And one which we've been doing more recently in the last 5 years is zoning is never going to stop development in some places where it shouldn't go. And so where we used to buy land as mostly backland to preserve for ecological purposes, we've begun to buy land in places a little bit to say, the market's just not going to protect this property, and it's a property that really shouldn't be developed. Owen mentioned before about one of the goals of being, having a clear line between urban and rural areas. We used to talk about urban rural and suburban rural. So we bought some land on Sylvester Road once to say, here's an area where suburbia really begins. Let's at least have a clear line between suburbia and Sylvester Road, and North Farm, and West Farms Road for that matter. to have a clear line between the two. So all those purposes. So again, you've seen this. So cluster. I first want to say I think our cluster doesn't work as well as it should. Although I still think our cluster is better than most towns' clusters. So it's worked. We've got some really good projects. Our cluster works incredibly well. I think it's really successful at enabling good projects to go forward. So the two co-housing projects, for example, are both cluster projects, and I think were great successes. Ice Pond Woods, or Ice Pond off Route 66 is a cluster. I think it's a great project. So it's worked really well for developers who want to play. The Oaks, which is now under construction, is a cluster that will never win any award for anything. So we have some really good things for developers who want to play, but we don't necessarily stop bad projects. So it goes it goes 2/3 the way there. But and we have a lot of flexibility. We were one of the first places in the state that had cluster regulations specifically around co-housing projects, saying it's okay to have a little bit of commercial, it's okay to have common buildings. That's one of the reasons that we have two co-housing projects.
So are you wanting to alter the cluster fairly soon?
Yeah, this is one of those things of, it's sort of someone's whole debate about this committee is, what's the balance between being deliberative and having bad projects that are happening during the process? So we made it fairly far in writing these regulations in 2002 when we decided we really need to go to a master planning process, and we never adopted it. On the one hand, I like the fact that we've had a lot of time to talk about this. On the other hand, we had some really bad projects, including the one I mentioned, the Oaks, in that time in between. So that's the balance game. 2 years ago, I would have said it was an absolute crisis to do our cluster regulations. The market slowed down a lot. We've also planning board's done a lot through the subdivision regulations that limit some of the bad projects we're getting. So it's less of a crisis, but we're getting, the projects off Glendale Road and West Hampton Road is back alive. So some people who have a long planning horizon are beginning to bring projects back on, saying the market's going to recover, now's a great time to build because it's really cheap. So we're getting our first subdivisions about to come in. In the last year, the only subdivision we had in the state hospital. So
you're thinking essentially make the cluster by right and create a special permit provision for everything else?
That's less important. It's funny, it's less important in Northampton than you think. It's the common wisdom that Danny was talking about is the thing I was saying before, that special permits really scare people away, and site plan approval gives people a guaranteed back. But it's also true in a relatively small community. Developers get what we're looking for. And if you ask any developer in town, any lawyer, any lawyer who works with them, they're going to say, that planning staff and that planning board really wants a cluster. And they're going to make your life a living hell if you don't do a cluster, and they're going to work with you to do a cluster. We have not had a non-cluster subdivision, other than the state hospital, which is a different world, in the last 12 years. So the reality is, I'm not that worried about the non-cluster projects. We should go there, you're absolutely right, I'm not that worried. What we have had is some bad clusters. Again, I think still better than non-clusters, but some bad clusters. The big difference in our focus has been the current rules say you have to have frontage on the street. And the reason you have to have frontage on the street is if you don't require frontage for a project, you run the risk of saying land which had no development value before could suddenly be developed and you could be opening the back land for development, which is not our goal. But the flip side is you get properties that have these really weird jury-weighted property boundaries to get that frontage, or they're building extra roads to get to the frontage. And so the art is finding the balance. How do you make sure that people aren't developing where they can't develop today? I mean, unless we want them to develop, but in the outlying areas, they're not developing in new, pristine areas. But that once we choose where they're developing, we're not getting stupid projects.
What are the things that define a cluster?
Basically, we have a minimum lot size in most areas. And what a cluster says is, instead of a minimum lot size per unit, we're going to look at the entire project and figure out the lot yield. So in simple numbers, if you had zoning that was one house per half acre, and you had 50 acres, you could do 100 half-acre lots. What if we said if you bought 50 acres, you get 100 units, but when you cluster those 100 units in half the property and preserve the other half of the property. Mm-hmm. And so that's our basic rule. We want 50% of land to be open space, and the homes clustered within that land. That part works really well. The question is, which is the 50% of land that's being preserved? And that's the part that doesn't work as well.
Well, plus it's also condos, too, it's shared ownership of the land.
No, that's what we're now getting to avoid subdivision regulations. So a cluster, all the clusters until very recent, until the last year, have been individual single-family homes. So Ice Pond plantations, the Oaks, all those projects have been individual single-family homes. So there's a separate set of regulations, which is subdivisions. And subdivision regulations say, here's how you build the public infrastructure. The roads, the sewer, the water lines, the sidewalks. We've gotten a lot stricter with that over the years, quite a bit stricter, which makes the cost go up. At the same time we've gotten stricter, the market has come to accept condos a lot more. In 1989, when we had the last big recession, condo prices dropped dramatically. I used to own a condo in Amherst and I lost all my equity. In this recession, condo prices have dropped a little more than single-family homes, but not that much more. So condos have really become more accepted. And condos that look like single-family homes are even more accepted. So Albert Place was done in Hadley, South Hadley about 12 years ago, and it was really cutting edge. Now it's not such a big deal. So that's the issue, is that Beaver Brook, which is under construction now in Leeds, looks and feels like a single-family home project. And everyone will own a house, and they have put up their little picket fences, and they have exclusive use of their property. But technically, the land will be owned as a whole, everyone had exclusive use. And they did it primarily with the subdivision regulations. But that's the first one we've had of those. So I think you're absolutely right, it's a trend coming, but we hadn't had that until then. And frankly, Beaver Brook's a test. We're seeing how successful it is. We have a zoning ordinance pending. One of the things that didn't go before because the timing was so critical, that would basically say the basic rules for a condo project in terms of infrastructure are still the subdivision regulations. And that's all about, if we're going to have stricter regs, we really want curbs to be granite so they last when the snowplow hits them. We have to discourage people from choosing a condo just to have cheaper materials. I'm not against condos, but I want someone to do a condo so they have a lousy curb just to avoid having a good curb. And so that's why that zoning is going to work.
I gotta say, I saw a presentation that Joel actually gave, not here tonight, but he gave on natural resource protection zoning, which might, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, but does address some of the frontage issues that you're talking about. So it kind of, comes at cluster from a slightly different,
That's right.
place. So it might be worth us having Joel talk to us a little bit about natural resource protection zoning, which apparently now has been declared legal in the state. Shelburne Falls, and I think one other town had put it on the books recently. So there's something for us to consider.
Yeah, I did a moonlighting project once in Wendell.
Wendell.
And that was sort of the challenge that we did in Wendell, is that Wendell wanted to do things. Wendell wanted to preserve big tracts of forest conservation land. So I can give you copies of that. The bylaw that I wrote for Wendell basically said the process would be the first step is you do an ecological assessment for the property. You come before the planning board, and the planning board works with you to figure out which 50% or 60%, whatever the number is, you have to preserve. In return for giving up a fair amount of control, and the planning board has to work with you. It can't be the back land that's impossible to get to, so it has to be realistic. But in return for doing that, then it has a right from that point forward. So the property owner can actually say, I know I'm going to get a permit for this. I'm working with the board up front, early in the process, before I spend a huge amount of money, and then I can move forward for doing it. So that's the approach that's there. So Wendell's working on it, and Shutesbury just adopted it last town meeting. But yeah.
Well, you're saying it's the frontage aspects of existing cluster that most needs addressing in a
I
fresh
think
review?
what land, I think there's two parts. The frontage aspects, absolutely, and what land's preserved, absolutely. So the Oaks really highlight, the Oaks had a beautiful wetland in the middle, and that wetland's preserved, and the project surrounds it. It's the project's a donut around the wetland. So the wetland will still be there, and you can still walk your dog there, but whatever ecological integrity it had isn't going to be there.
Where's the Oaks?
The Oaks is off Birds Pit Road. And the Oaks is, it's a model in different constituencies. So I want to be clear, I don't want to sound like I'm blaming the developer. The first developer got it right totally. He was going to preserve the wetlands in the complex, he was going to build all on one side. And he was going to do it by doing multifamily homes. And the neighborhood came out and was pretty outraged and said, this is a single family home only neighborhood. We allow multifamily homes in the cluster. We don't want multifamily homes, we want single family homes. Single family homes take up more land. And then the developer came back based on neighborhood input, and they were threatening to sue him. This may be the part that was allowed by right, because he was really worried of being sued. He wasn't worried of the planning board, but even the planning board gave a permit, it could be appealed. And that's why, so it wasn't necessarily a bad developer. It was a bad developer, it was a good developer initially. And strong neighbor opposition, it came back to single family homes. The neighborhood was happier, the wetlands was less happy.
He was worried about being sued by the neighborhood?
Yeah, the neighborhood and the ward council were pretty
Yeah.
universally clear that there should not be multiple homes. So that's part of the balance. Now, you know, on the other hand, the co-housing projects, half a mile away, have been pretty well accepted by both the neighbors and the tenants, although the one problem with them from an ecological standpoint is you drive through the open space to get to them, so they're pretty isolated from their homes. So you don't have neighbors, you don't have that. Some just, the wetlands are where the wetlands are. I mean, you can't always say we're never going to cross a wetland to get to a project, because in this case, off Florence Road, there's a big wetlands complex, and you have a big upland area. You can't get to the upland area without crossing. But they have a single crossing and pretty well preserved. All right, then, you know, we have lots of stuff on the downtown side, lots of incentives. All these projects have something to do with regulations that we have of encouraging commercial, residential.
I just want to do a time check, it's about 20 after, I'm not sure how much more you have.
I got a lot more.
Yeah, I figured
So-
we did. Maybe we can go to 20 up, because I think if we can do last stuff in 20
Okay,
minutes.
all right. So let me race through these. So I won't go through these. There's lots of zoning provisions we have that encourage the mixed use. It's been one of the successes. I've now been here forever, so I've been here 21 years. But when I got here, the majority of downtown businesses, upper floors were commercial. The majority of downtown businesses now are upper floors are residential. It's been, you know, on one hand, it's because people don't want to have walk-up offices without elevators, and because people want easier access for parking. We can say parking's fine, but the reality is businesses are voting with their feet downtown to have easy parking. And we've had that transition that's worked for us. And so we've had lots of great incentives. I won't run through this, you know, but we have lots of things in the zoning that do it. Let me race through really fast. So likewise on highway business, we have lots of incentives to encourage buildings to move up to the street, to require two-story buildings, good models for how we want to do that, and very few takers. And we've definitely lost development opportunities for a lot of reasons. You know, people who don't like the zoning will say it's the zoning's fault. People who love the zoning can point out other reasons. The reality is projects fail for a combination of reasons. Zoning is a piece. You know, we've been thinking internally, just at the staff level, how do you avoid the zoning getting gutted? And what's most important. What the zoning did is it moved the buildings close to the street, it improved the focus and design, and encouraged two-story buildings. And I will say the part that the market has been least, the market doesn't like any of those things. But the part the market's been most hostile to is two-story buildings. From my standpoint, two-story buildings is least important. So whereas I like the idea of two-story buildings, I would say I'm much worried about buildings being forced back from the street and compromising design standards. So at least the part I'll pitch for you all is let's, you know, make some concessions while keeping what's really important that's out there. I won't go through this, but you know, lots of other incentives we play with. How do you get life on the street? It's really important zoning not to be these rigid lines. So we used to have a rigid setback line, and then we said, well, we really like porches, which people on the porch can interact with the street, so let's put incentives. We have a series of these things, window boxes, where we have different standards. Transfer development rights is a big thing I think you're going to look at. My advice to you, for what it's worth, is I'm a great believer in TDR. We have TDR in the books. This basically we say, here's some open space. We're going to take the development rights off this open space and move it somewhere else and preserve the land. It's not a panacea, so it shouldn't be a priority. I think it's really important, but it's going to preserve relatively little amount of land. Great when you have time to get to it, but unlike the cluster, we get all these projects all the time. I'm going to skip some of these things, such requirements. You're up if you're interested in these things. I mentioned this about the watershed protection, and floodplain. Again, we have some incentives to encourage affordable housing, but the area to be careful of spending a lot of effort on feel-good things. This is probably my fault, but we have a cluster ordinance which gives you bonus density to have affordable housing. But the reality is we've only had two projects who've ever asked for that, and both projects failed. And the reason is when they look at the market doesn't want the density that we allow anyway, so they don't need the bonus density. It doesn't do them any good. And that's basically always going to be true as long as the project is single-family homes. If you start moving to multifamily, then something goes. Inclusionary housing, we played with this. I've done a project in a couple other towns on draft inclusionary housing zoning, so we've done a couple of drafts of it. Danielle and her PPPC hat is going to help us take some of those old drafts and work on them, just to throw out for drafts. We have lots of stuff in Northampton that sort of, depending on you look at our incentives for inclusionary housing, the incentive side, or almost mandates that side. I have to spend time on this. When you get to housing, we can come back to
What
this.
do you mean by inclusionary in that part?
So the difference is, the idea of incentive is, what are the things that encourage you to do affordable housing? The inclusionary is what are the things that make you do inclusionary housing? So planning board says, for a subdivision, if you don't meet the subdivision standards, the only way you're going to waiver is provide affordable housing. Or do a traditional neighborhood development, say a hospital. As a practical matter, almost every project requires some waivers. So as a practical matter, almost every project is getting a waiver and therefore giving us affordable housing. There's bonus density. Bonus density can be things like, I mentioned the cluster, where you get an extra 10% affordable housing, 20% bonus density, but people don't really want it. Or it can be a bonus density mentioned, where you have so much, where you get bumped up by 3 districts. So we have one project that failed, but more because of the market, right next to the food co-op, just to the north and to the west of the food co-op, that I could have done, I think it's 2 single-family homes, and the bonus density could allow to do 69 units. So in theory, it's bonus density, but practically, it's inclusion. You couldn't really use the property unless you could do it. So inclusionary says, we expect you to give this to us. Instead, it means we're going to encourage you to do it. And again, the basic idea of inclusionary zoning is, we want you to give us affordable housing. It's not your responsibility to make up for there not being enough affordable housing in the community. It's your responsibility for, Northampton right now is 11.9% affordable housing. So it's logical to say, for example, every new developer should give us 11.9% affordable housing, not to make up to get more affordable housing, but just to make sure that all their units don't make us have less affordable housing. That's a pretty easy thing to justify. There's been some court cases about it, and I think it's clear we can do it, although it hasn't been tested that much. I'm not going to talk about exemptions. If you get to Smith College or churches, there's some limits to what we can do, but I'm going to race through these things. I'm going to skip a bunch of things to go on. So these are all about limits, and we can come back to you. But this is important for the Home Rule Act, just so you know. Massachusetts is allegedly a home rule state. It basically is some states like North Carolina, which say local governments can only do what the state government lets them do. They have to pass enabling statutes. In Massachusetts, we say in non-financial things, so away from taxes, police power stuff, you can do anything you want as long as the state hasn't told you you can't do it. Or as long as the state hasn't so-called covered the field. So the state says we're doing building code. The state says we're doing the zoning act. So if you pass zoning, you have to meet the building, you have to meet the zoning. But if you create your own ordinance, you don't have to. So we have a central business architecture ordinance downtown that regulates the way buildings look downtown. It's not through zoning, it's not through historic districts. That means we can do whatever we want to do. We're not looking at those things. So zoning is very, very restrictive in the process. If you think we should have 66 days to review a permit application instead of 65 days, you have to go to the state legislature to change it. But if you think we should totally rewrite cluster and what the basic rules are for how projects should be done, God bless you, have a great time. So those things the state has told us we have to do, we have to do. There's some really stupid things. If you're doing a subdivision and need a zoning permit and a wetlands permit, you're dealing with 3 different statutes that don't always agree with each other. We can't do anything about that because it's the state statute. There's this great case in 2003 that basically said it was okay for Bellingham to blackmail somebody, and it's still legal. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they basically rezoned the property in return for $8 million. No claim whatsoever that $8 million had anything to do with mitigation for the property. And the SJC said that's just fine. What they said is, this only had to make sense, there had to be some logic behind it, but what the motivation was doesn't really matter. So, Hong was pretty powerful in this kind of stuff. This is one of the first cases that said, yes, we can do a lot of stuff that might look and feel a little bit like zoning. We can do this through other ordinances. So there's a state, this case specifically about wetlands, there's a state wetlands protection law, but towns can still do their own wetlands ordinances, that's fine, as long as the state doesn't cover it. Examples of ordinances we have right now that are home rule, we can do lots more. I'm going to skip some of this stuff. We can talk more later, but one of the sort of big picture challenges for you all is to think about form-based code. I just did a project in Port Angeles, Washington a couple weeks ago, and one of our recommendations to them was they think about form-based code. So this is the plan we did for them, but in their case, there was sort of this strip development that was this sort of one undifferentiated strip, and so we were talking about exactly what are the real opportunities to develop there, and is the classic 5-minute walk circle, and how could they do zoning for that. So when you get to that stage, I can go back and talk more detail. Or Joel was actually, this is actually his bigger expertise. He's written one of the best books on form-based codes. So this form-based code stuff, and this form-based code as well. All right, I just want to run through all the zoning districts. So these are just separates of each of the zoning districts in town. So I could run through all 20 of them and give you a quick, 1 minute per zoning district what we have, and let you know sort of what are the challenges.
30 seconds per district.
30 seconds per district, okay. So central business district is the most permissive. It used to be very small. The theory was it was really central. We've expanded it a couple times in the last 10 years. It's doubled in size. I think we should expand it more. It's sort of a carrot and stick approach. It says we want the first floor to be commercial, no residential on the first floor. We really want it to be vibrant, we want it to be walkable, but above the first floor almost anything goes. That's sort of the carrot. The stick is we have central business architecture, totally different ordinance. It's home rule, it's art design standards, and the district just happens to always be exactly the same place. So whenever City Council expands central business zoning, we have an ordinance at exactly the same council meeting to expand central business architecture. So that's the carrot and stick. I think it's still operative. As I say, we've doubled this in size. We've been really aggressive about expanding to cover all the commercial districts around downtown to be more permissive. And I think that's really important. I think there's more opportunities. We've been much, much more careful about expanding to cover residential areas because part of what makes downtown vibrant is the number of people who walk downtown. When we did our downtown plan 14 years ago, we counted the number of people who live within half a mile and a mile of downtown, and we looked at the same thing for Springfield. And at the time, we had almost twice as many people walking distance from our downtown to Springfield. The classic test I love, because I'm one of those people who lives within a mile, is go downtown during any snowstorm. And just the number of people who are there is really partially because the number of people who walk downtown. So that's really important. We've done some State Street. It used to be State Street was zone line, and some west side of State Street was residential. We've now zoned that commercial, so you see the bakery that's there, you see some real estate offices. We've allowed that sort of expansion, but we've been really careful about doing that. We've tried to balance it as we have more residential on the second floors and third floors in downtown to make us more comfortable to lose the residential on the first floor. So it's an area I hope we come back to and keep expanding this that's out there. General business is very similar to central business. Its main difference is a little stricter on parking. And it doesn't have design standards. I certainly think, personally, some of the general business, particularly on Pleasant Street, should go to central business. I think Florence is very sensitive to it. They probably don't want to go to central business, but it'd be fine if they wanted to do it. So again, general business and central business are basically the areas that are pedestrian scale, that are walkable. Highway business is the area we haven't defined as well as I think we should. It's the area that's traditionally highway oriented. We've tried to make changes that make it more pedestrian friendly while still acknowledging the majority of trips driven by car. Some of the discussion in the plan is, should this be one undifferentiated area, or should we think about it in different districts? I think some people think different districts mean north of Dame Road should be one thing, and south should be something else. Some people think it should just go as far as Acme Auto, but just thinking about different areas. There's a tiny neighborhood, tiny high business up in Leeds as well. So neighborhood business is one of those things that we haven't really totally defined. These used to be little pockets of commercial all over town. A lot of them we've converted. So Florence, we've expanded the general business, taking over neighborhood business, and downtown we've expanded central business, taking over general business. Those have made sense with places like Jim's Variety Store, that are still neighborhood business. We have a neighborhood business here that is no business. So again, from this, it's interesting to think about, you know, what are the opportunities? It's small enough that if you don't have time, it's not really that important. It's not going anywhere. Medical is really important for you to think about a little bit. Medical right now is just the Cooley Dickinson campus. And this is really about encouraging Cooley Dickinson to expand. But we certainly thought from a sustainability standpoint, one of the biggest sectors that's driving our commercial market right now is doctor's offices. And there's some real benefit to think about how are there opportunities, without going to neighborhoods, or without going to neighborhoods a little bit, to allow more doctor's offices near Cooley Dickinson, because you get a lot of doctors who are going back and forth between the hospital. And is that an opportunity to reduce some of the trips, is that more sustainable? We just passed some rules, or about to pass rules at the state hospital to make it harder to have medical there, thinking that those are very high trip generation things. So thinking about the vision for the medical right here is Cooley Dickinson. They were originally doing professional offices on campus. They are now not going that route. And so I still think there's a need for medical offices that's nearby there. Planned Village, I won't spend time unless people want to, because I think it's sort of mature, but you can come back if you want. One is we haven't really well defined. We have a general industrial district, which is, you can see the sort of gray areas, and then we have a special industrial district. And special industrial is mostly the old mill buildings. General industrial is we think of as being the larger, heavier industrial sites. Special industrial is more of the red brick mill buildings around town. But the definition isn't totally clear. I think it's worth working on. We've talked a couple of times about should we merge the two areas together and have one district. This goes back to the thing that Owen mentioned about how you preserve land for industrial uses. And so there's a balancing act. You know, special industrial allows more non-industrial uses in, some of the workspace, dance studios, which potentially makes us lose industrial land, but it also gives more flexibility for properties. And so it's the balancing act between those two.
Is it only SI where live workspace is allowed now?
In industrial, correct. We allow workspace in other commercial and business districts we go. Business Park is always one of the more controversial districts. This is on Route 10. When it was first adopted, I got here, it started doing this zoning stuff 18 years ago, and I've been environmentally for that. And Business Park was proposed for general industrial. It was very controversial. We proposed this business park, it's a big compromise, that 50% of land is to be preserved as open space. Mass Audubon at the time endorsed it, but it's very controversial now. It's very sensitive land. Where does it go? But it's the last, this after the state hospital is really the last big opportunity for commercial development there.
And in those 18 years, have you ever had a project that somebody tried to build it?
No, but we did it deliberately. We wanted to avoid the East Hampton approach of strip projects. This says you have to master plan it, have a minimum of 70 acres, and have to have sewer. Because otherwise it will all become spaces for rent in tiny little places. So we wanted to master plan. We know that would mean subsidies, and our focus has been the state hospital. So there hasn't really been a lot of opportunities. Urban residential C, this is basically, there's a couple of minor exceptions. This is the tightest donut around downtown. A little more in the flat section of downtown, so more in Ward 3, a little less in the steep section downtown, but mostly sort of a whole ring around downtown. It's the most multifamily district of the downtown itself. Sort of tells a story, you know, the pre-war dense urban areas around downtown. So it's sort of well defined. URB is the next donut around downtown, and for the most part, the pre-war housing in Northampton. So it also sort of tells a story. Drive around a neighborhood where it's primarily single-family homes and two families, and those homes were primarily built before World War II, and you're probably in a URB district. You may not know exactly the boundaries of URB and URC, but you can sort of guess where it is. So it sort of tells a story. URA, if we're going less density, URA to me tells the least story. You have, those of you on the last planning board, URA is a pocket right here, that's URB on both sides of it. URA here is URB over here. All these areas logically make a strong argument should be URB. We did some upzoning about 5 years ago, had about 80 areas of town. They all passed council except these two areas in URA, that area, that area. We did some rezonings downtown to URB to URC. That was not controversial, and this one and this one, you would have thought the world was falling in. One of the thoughts that we've had is these are, and certainly fits into the state of Northampton saying areas for more density. It was interesting in the discussions that we had in the neighborhood, what they were really scared of is two-family homes. So this may be less from a zoning standpoint, but more from a political standpoint. One approach to allow more density without creating these huge battles might be to say, keep URA single-family home only, but change the lot size to the same thing as URB. It would allow a fair amount of infill and not go into that zone. One of the challenges in this neighborhood in some ways,
You're trying to fill in Chelsea Park.
no,
You keep
The
pointing
rest
to
of
it,
the
I'm
area.
like, you keep saying we got infill, you keep pointing to Chelsea
here,
Park.
here, and here. One of the challenges in this area is, I would say at least a third of the homes, if not half the homes, are pre-existing non-conforming. That is, the homes themselves don't meet the zoning requirements. And that, to me, is always the dangerous sign. And this goes back to how much time do we waste on staff time. That means someone's applying for a permit to expand their house, they have to come before the zoning board. Doesn't help the applicant, doesn't help us, doesn't help it.
Yeah, I'm just curious, so when you change the lot size, the landowner can just split it and sell off?
Yeah, there's not many opportunities. We did the analysis at the time. There's a couple of lots here. There's not, the opportunity is more for expansion of homes. There are some. But because these lots are built out with homes in the middle, even if it was totally replatted, you could do it. And since most of the homes were under the old zoning, so you have, I've got the number, I could look it up, but 10 homes. It wasn't a huge number, but 10 homes is still good. And 10 homes is still, you know, these are kids who walk to school and don't require any new police services and don't require any new fire services and fit the neighborhood. And you know, we're commuting against 30 new homes a year before the recession. So 10 new homes is still significant. I gotta make up the number that I remember. But, so this area makes, this area, the URA, at least I understand the logic of the battery design. The URA here, in here are later developments. This is sort of a funny area. It was done after World War II, but it's totally surrounded by the World War II neighborhoods. And so you could sort of make it URB. This area is lower density. But then you get, this area is Hatfield's water supply. This area is Northampton's water supply. So where I said, you know, this is a story for URB and URC. You know, these, to me, there's a certain story as an urban area, and there's a totally different story for these areas. And some of it may be before, these date back to before we knew where the water supply protection districts were. But so the opportunities are very different on this side than this side. So suburban residential is the next rural area. The comprehensive plan certainly says most of this area, at least on this side of Florence Road, is the area we want to discourage development to the extent possible. Doesn't mean no development, but discouraging it. There's probably not enough real estate in this area to allow the city to grow with new homes without making the price of housing go up really high. And one of the goals is to, I think one of the goals should be to artificially, to not having housing prices artificially escalated by limiting the amount of land. And so you probably need some relief valve where downtown should grow. So the plan at some, I've got the exact boundaries, but the plan at some of this is saying that makes sense for growth. Most of it's water and sewer and is walkable, at least from basic Florence, out here is different. And these are the areas where most of the subdivisions we've had in the last 10 years until the state hospital has mostly been in this area. So this is the area we have to make decisions quickly. We downzoned a little bit over here because it's water supply protection.
How much of SR would you say has water sewer now?
Water, for water, most of it. For sewer, very little of it. I couldn't tell you exactly what, but water's pretty easy to go places. So rural residential is even further out. Again, for the most part, this is state hospital, so it doesn't really matter over here. But rural residential is almost universally the areas which we say shouldn't be developed, with a little exception over here. This is certainly an area that should be looked at carefully. What's the edge of downtown? Special conservancy is what I mentioned. Can you see the color at all? I can't remember. But special conservancy is the Connecticut River floodplain. So it's defined exactly. We took the FEMA maps, the federal floodplain maps. So it's pretty well defined, but as I say, it doesn't go up all the rivers in town. This is the watershed protection district. So this is an overlay over the different districts. So this is the area that's also floodplain, and yet it's much easier to build in this area. Some large properties on the market right now here, which makes me most concerned about it. but it's going to happen else. There's other opportunities for development watershed protection. Here, I'm particularly concerned because I know there's two big properties on the market. We may have a breathing spell because one of the properties is selling for $1.9 million or something. It isn't worth anywhere close to that. But certainly developers will look at the properties out there. And it's probably some most sensitive land in town. This is the transfer development rights that I mentioned. The background is when Governor Will was elected, he was going to balance the state budget in the last recession by selling surplus property. We didn't like that, and so we rezoned all the state hospital wanted to preserve as farms, forests, and rivers, which is basically mandatory transfer development rights. We then got legislation through to preserve the land, so this TDR would never happen because no one's been developed. It's on the books for symbolic reasons, because if you all said, we want transfer development rights, we already have something in the zoning, so we have to suggest as a map that says farms, forests, rivers over here. The challenge with transfer development rights, you may know, is everybody's happy to be a sending zone. It means you can preserve the land and the property owner gets paid for it, but no one wants to go to a receiving zone. No one wants to get the units. We said the units would go to the state hospital, again, the time before we had legislation to do it. Education use overlay, this is the Smith College area. This basically said Smith could go through this cumbersome legal process to get greater height anyway. Let's give them the height which they want, that they can get anyway by going through a more difficult court process. In return, let's get the things that we think are important. Where in the we just changed the historic district in Elm Street, and the other project Danielle's working on at PVPC had is looking at West Street, again for a non-zoning solution. So the idea is to say, we're happy for Smith to build in this area, we're happy for the extra height. What we really care about is the public realm where Smith College meets the community. So we care about Elm Street, to some extent Kensington, Round Hill, and we care about West Street. And so we're focused on what we care about through non-zoning issues, and we do the internal campuses, it's fine. Residential status, this thing I mentioned before, this is a bonus density for affordable housing. It's never been a great success. It was done, the city did a plan in '85 of where we have excess sewer capacity. And two things have happened since '85. First is traffic is much more an issue, a limited development than sewer capacity. So this area doesn't necessarily have great traffic opportunities. And the other thing is all the sewer lines have all changed, so that King Street, for example, is actually one of the most taxed areas of sewer in town, and yet it's residential. So as a district, it doesn't make sense. We kept it on the books to spark discussion. This is water supply protection. This is Northampton's water supply, groundwater. It serves 2% of our water now, but in emergencies can serve 50% of our water. This is our surface water supply. That's emergency only. We have boiled water effectively used it, but we still want to preserve it for the future. This is Hatfield's water supply, which is really important because Hatfield protects our water supply. And this is East Hampton's water supply down here, and this map here. Slightly different rules. This is sort of a political compromise. This area basically has minimum lot size of 80,000 square feet, almost 2 acres. Again, you can cluster it. This area has minimum lot size of 1 acre. And personally, it should be 2 acres. The same argument from both a water supply protection standpoint, and coincidentally, it's an area that probably shouldn't be developed in terms of what Sustainable Northampton says. So it's easier for me to have bigger lot sizes if there's a reason anyway. That's it.
Wow. Very fast. There was 80 slides in less than 80 minutes. Wow. Very good.
That was great.
Yeah, so if you could email it, maybe email it to me, or can I get it to Dylan? That'd be great. Question?
Well,
What were you asking, really, while we had Wayne?
I'm not going to go into this, but you know I have this because I know Carrollton has some discussion on state use regulations. So I have some extracts of your questions on any
Well, I think what we're going to probably do is plan out more of these, maybe in specific areas as we go forward, as we get towards a particular topic. You or Carolyn will, Carolyn, I think, will be most of the meeting, we'll invite you back, and we can talk about specific issues. So that would be great.
I had a question about that cluster. You had PDU on there as well, plan development. What is the difference in association we didn't talk about?
The way we do it, they used to be very different. They're now pretty similar. It's mostly what the mix of uses is. The only PUD we've ever had has been the, Fairway Village, where it was, it's up in Leeds, it's townhouses and a country club up there. It allows slightly more commercial. The cluster only allows commercial like what you'd expect from a co-housing project. You know, a captive office, things that are sort of captive to the project. PUD allows things that aren't as captive. The reason it's never really come up is, with the exception of the reuse of a golf course, we're not a city that has big parcels of land. For us, 50-acre parcel of land being developed is a huge project. PUD works more if you have 1,000 acres of land. It's never going to happen. We'd actually talked about it. It's just silly. It's wasting space in the zoning ordinance. Let's get rid of it, and to the extent we don't mind commercial, let's add that commercial to the cluster.
Yeah.
Because usually the two ordinances, they're 80% the same. They actually refer to each other. And it just gets confusing. Whoever wrote it 30 years ago, PUD is a big thing. It's just not fit for us.
Anybody else got
The current zoning in the outer wards, when did that go into place?
Well, I mean, we've had zoning since like 1929 or something. Our modern zoning ordinance was born in 1975, and the basic rules have not really changed since '75. We've done lots of things pasting on, so we've made dramatic changes. And they say downtown, we're really sort of the leader. I mean, we always get invited to conferences because people like the language that we do. But the outlying stuff has not changed that much other than adding cluster to it. In this area, we're very, very, all the commercial stuff, we're very, very different than we were in the past. In this area, take away the overlays, which added restrictive rules, and take away cluster, it's the same thing it was in '75.
Prior to '75,
Prior to '75,
what was in place?
there was zoning, and it was not very restrictive. There was some about uses. You couldn't do multifamily outlying areas. There was some dimensional. The entire zoning ordinance was probably 10 pages, but it was a pretty short ordinance. So not that, enough that we try to figure out what's pre-existing non-conforming. If someone shows that they're before '75, more often than not, in fact, they were grandfathered. And even with zoning there was, the zoning board at the time gave variances like they were candy. So an awful lot of uses that the zoning table says wouldn't allow, you could have gotten permission. And some of them, you look at some of the housing authority properties, and the variance says, okay, build a 100-unit project. And they can't even tell you what they approved. That's literally like a one-paragraph thing to say, okay. That was what everybody was doing in '75. The bad thing that happened in '75 is they went to modern zoning, which was really good in some ways. We've learned a lot since then. But in the urban areas, they were really to some extent trying to say, urban areas are dying compared to suburbia, we have to be more suburban.
Right.
So that was the birth of all these lots where all the homes were pre-existing non-conforming. And we've gone back, that's the area we've cracked a lot. Getting rid of that URA 5 years ago was really controversial, but we went from minimum lot size of URA at 15,000 square feet to now I think it's 8,000 square feet. And that wasn't controversial. So we've done some pretty significant reduction in lot size. URB and URC, we went from, I think it was 8,000 to 6,000 square feet. Frontage was something now 75 about what it was before. So we've done a lot of those things. One of my concerns, there's always a discussion, it certainly comes up with Board 3, but elsewhere as well, is what does infill mean, and does that mean more density? And one of the challenges that's clearly come up, if I can go backwards this thing, but is we have some pretty strong incentives in our zoning, which we've reduced a little bit, towards multifamily. So if you have a lot in URB or even more in URC, the lot yield is a lot greater if you do townhouses or multifamily than you do in single family. And I have nothing against multifamily, it's a really important part of the mix. But to me, part of the solution, and again, it's my personal values, but is reducing the minimum lot size for single family homes dramatically, which sounds like it increases density, but it may mean you don't force somebody into doing multifamily homes. And at least it levels the playing field. And we've done some of that over the years. We've increased the lot size for multifamilies, we've decreased it for single families. But I think that's at least part of this discussion, is not the wrong number of people. The other thing you all should know is, for all we've done for increasing density in downtown, the area within a mile of downtown, which has been successful in terms of a significant increase in the number of units that we have, the population in that area has continued to drop, and drop pretty dramatically. So what happens is, as we get some X number of more units, family size keeps dropping. So if you go from 4 people per family to 2.1 per family, even if you have 20% more units, you're going to have fewer people. So the area in walking distance of downtown has been declining, not dramatically, but significantly over 20 years, even though a huge number of housing units are in there.
Because of, what's the reason for that?
Family size is dropping. So Northampton's
In our
population,
society, just
and
bigger houses,
Northampton,
less people.
right, in Northampton, a little faster than nationwide trends. I mean, mostly we follow nationwide trends, but we're a little faster. We were dramatically faster when the state hospital closed. And what happened is, if you look at the numbers, you say Northampton's population isn't growing. Actually, the last 20 years it's been shrinking. But we went from 1,500 people in 50 acres of buildings to, you know, what's that, 90 units around town. So the acreage that has been consumed has been a lot. So that final zoning map, I can't just check. We did this number, we applied for grants that helped pay for the Sustainable Northampton project. And one of the things we did is we did an assessment of different sections of town. And we just did models of how many people live within 100 acres here, and how many people live within 100 acres here. We said, look, this is the most expensive, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in town. And yet it has about 5 times the number of people. I mean, I think that number is 4 times as out here. So density isn't all about the value of the neighborhood. Now, poor density is. So that was sort of the argument we were making.
Wayne, did you have one thing you want to ask us about before? You said you had one.
Oh, so two things I'm pushing. One I mentioned is the staffing. Anything which reduces people requiring a special permit saves staff time. My priority is to look at the one, not making zoning changes you wouldn't make otherwise, but one of my priorities is you think about things that really shouldn't require a special permit, it's worth putting on top of the list, because we're just not going to do a good job of things. And we need to, we're going to be going to council in the very near future with a series of zoning and non-zoning ordinance changes that are all based on saving staff time, because we can't staff everything. And so those things are going to move forward, and rather do it with your input and without your input, but we just need to do it to survive those things. Yeah. The other one is the green communities that you mentioned. Have you discussed green communities here?
Briefly, well, this is our second meeting, so briefly came up with the
So
first one.
there's a chunk of money, the state's been doing this whole thing, the way the state's been giving out money these days is they reward you for doing good things. And it's nice to reward you for doing good things, but there's a series of deliverables you have to do. And the latest chunk of money is a bunch of money for so-called green communities who are encouraging renewable energy, which I think is great. And we looked at the things you need. In order to be eligible, you need to allow by right either generation of renewable energy or manufacture of renewable energy components. We already allow manufacturing renewable energy components, so we meet that. And you have to guarantee you'll give those permits within a year. Now, we've never taken more than a year ever to issue a permit, but we don't meet the state statute. And so Carolyn wrote just today the zoning ordinance which we introduced to the Energy and Sustainability Committee, which they may, any committee, any standing committee can use zoning, they may move forward. And I don't think it's ever going to affect anything. It will go into the applicability section of zoning, or I forgot what section you put it under. It will basically say, if you're applying for, to make energy components, then we have to tell you within 45 days when your application is complete. And if your application is complete, we have to act within a year. Practically, it's really just to the points, frankly. But if you want to weigh in on that, I don't think it's substantive.
Well, I think there were 3 items in the appendix that we were going to look at that all were associated with green communities.
So except for this one thing, we meet the zoning that's required. So the thing that's really,
I just have one question with that before you go on to the next thing. Does the state define renewable manufacturing? Or can that be defined or hashed out by?
see, we allow all manufacturing by right. development in certain zoning districts.
Okay,
And we
so
allow
that's
all
certain.
research and develop. So I don't know if the state does, but ours is
Oh,
broad.
it's blanket. It's not about renewables.
That's correct.
So,
Right. So the point that's really timely for us to get this money, which we'd like to get, is this time period. The state says you can either do renewable manufacturing by right or renewable installations by right. We don't need the renewable installations because we get the manufacturing, so there's no time pressure for it, but that should certainly be in your bailiwick, because should we also be allowing renewable installations?
I think, actually, we'll talk in a minute about the agenda for next meeting, but I think one of the items we'll talk about is the green community, what work we have to do for that, because there's been a couple of emails that popped around, I think Abe knew someone out. So it's been on some people's minds, so that might be one of the priorities we look at first. Okay, great. Was it just those two? Well, thanks. It was, like I said, we'll bring it back. Okay. We'll probably have some more questions. Just quickly, there were a couple other things. For the agenda for next time, as Wayne mentioned, green development. We'll also look at the zoning list that we didn't get to today. In fact, we'll probably do that one first. We'll start talking with Carolyn about that list. And
This is the prioritized
right, the
by
planning board went through it and applied their priorities, so next time we see it, we'll see what the planning board put as their priorities, but then we can work on our own as well. Also, there were some discussions we had, well, not discussions, but there's some mailings about parking. So we'll get Joel, and Joel's here at the next meeting, we'll get Joel to talk a little bit about that and see what he wants to do. There was one, Jim, did you want to talk about the zero lot line, or did you have a question about that?
Well, yeah, the thing I wanted to say was that, first of all, I'm exhausted. Thank you, Wayne. That was great.
For making you exhausted?
No, but that, I know that, well, first of all, my reading of zero lot line is that it's really hard to interpret. And I think that's part of where it struggles to win approval and move forward. And that, if the planning board and the planning department would like us to take a shot at maybe looking at the way that it's put together.
Well, the way it came up at the last planning board meeting, I think some people, Jim, you were at you were at the seminar, the workshop that Carolyn did at Bridge Street School.
Right.
That then came to the planning board last Thursday.
Right.
We rejected it, and now it's into the hands.
Yeah, there's no information yet.
Sorry, we declined to recommend it to the ordinance subcommittee. So now the ordinance committee takes it, even though we have declined to recommend it. So it's right now, it's in the hands of the ordinance committee for the city council. So the city council has it now.
Okay.
So we did change some of the wording, and we did add an amendment to it. We had a discussion, I think we talked about it for an hour and a half on Thursday.
So your declining of it is something like a recommendation towards the city council? I mean, it still goes to the city
Yeah,
council.
it goes-
No comment is no recommendation, because they didn't make a recommendation.
So yeah, we declined
Which
to
sounds
recommend it.
pretty negative to me, if I'm a city councilor.
They were there,
Yeah.
and the ordinance committee was there, so Reckman, Michael Bardsley,
Yeah.
and Narkowitz were all there at the meeting, and they participated in the discussion as well. So they heard the exact same thing the planning board did. So zero lot line at this point, Jim, is up to the city council to decide what they want to do with it.
Okay. All right. Well, so it may come back around again as something to be looked at. And can I talk about it? I don't know.
I also
Because it's before
well, we're not, it's part of, it's before the ordinance committee, but it has nothing to do
All
with
right.
us.
So I think that part of where it struggles is figuring out what exactly it says. And it's not just me as, somebody who's learning about zoning. I've also talked to a few developers who were scratching their heads. And I think that, maybe that could be one of the summer projects to look at.
It could be. I think it depends on what they
The
decide.
wording of it.
And the discussion even came up that night, it should have been referred back to us. And I think one of the things that we'll see, part of the discussion is, not every piece of zoning will come to us. And we don't have to wait for something to be referred to us
Right.
if we want to take it up.
Right.
So the planning board or the ordinance committee will send something to us. but something's gonna go through the normal process as it is today.
Let's sort of quickly for zero law line development, the city council can do one of two things. Either then turn down the entire thing, in which case certainly have discussions for that, or the other options that someone can do on the planning board to go this route is parts of it were not particularly controversial, parts were very controversial.
Right.
So one approach, I would be amazed, I don't think there's any chance they're gonna adopt it the way it is now. So even if they adopt it, I suspect they're gonna adopt, and they may not adopt it, I expect they adopt the non-controversial parts, so you'd still have an opportunity to look at the controversial parts, either say we don't do anything.
So do you think they'll adopt the non-controversial?
I have no idea about that.
Okay.
I think that, I'm sure they're not gonna adopt the controversial parts. Whether they do the non-controversial, I don't know.
Well, from my perspective, that was part of the confusion was like, you know, there's this all right, put a driveway over there, that makes some sense, and get rid of the fences, and then, and then the more controversial stuff of building up to the lot line, and
The part that was the most controversial was that if you have two pieces of property and you do not control both of them,
all right,
as long as you get an agreement from the person on the other side, you can build up to it. And there's no public comment, meaning the neighborhood, the abutters don't have any say. So it just takes two people to get together and say, hey, I want to build up to my lot line. Will you give me an easement? Now, still, it's a deed restricted,
so the guy on the opposite side could get the agreement.
has to agree.
Okay.
So the way it is today is if a developer owns both halves of the lot line, they can build right up to the lot line,
Right.
by right. And the only time the planning board would ever have to see it, or the neighborhood would ever have any input, is if they didn't want to put a fence in between. And so, as long as the developer wanted to put up a fence between the two pieces of property, they can do it by right now.
The reason for that by right, history is, this goes back to equalizing the playing field. They could do a two-family by right, and they would do a two-family right for 20 years. So the idea is, if you want to do a single-family home, two single-family homes back-to-back that look just like a two-family home, why would we want to stop that? So that was why 5 years ago, whenever city council passed this the first time, they did it by right, is saying you could already do a two-family.
So the controversial part of the whole thing, at least my thought on what was controversial was the idea that if you have two different owners on either side of the lot line, the owner A could build up to the lot line as long as owner B granted them the ability to do so. And the neighborhood, meaning people here, and all around, don't have any input on it. And that's the thing that seemed to bother people the most
And currently for that to happen,
today.
yeah.
For that to happen today, I don't think it's possible without getting,
Well, you could do a game, which is one of the reasons we brought this up, is you could, if you're a very trusting neighbor, you could technically, your neighbor could transfer the property to you for $1. He then own both pieces,
then you
get
build
the
it.
property, not even build it, then you get a building permit, and then you transfer the property back for $1. And so you have a lawyer who could do that, so it became this loophole fight. But I think you're, I don't, Jim, I have no idea whether council will approve or not, but if they do, I suspect they drop this controversial.
Right, and that's the part that people didn't like, is that you could do it, if you own both sides, you can do it by right, neighbors can't say anything. If you don't own both sides, and you get the two neighbors to agree, they can do it. But still, the neighbors, the way it's written, the neighbors wouldn't get any input. And the big sticking point was, a bunch of people said, no, the neighbors should have an input as to whether or not these two can work out an agreement, then everybody else in the neighborhood should have a chance to weigh in.
Right.
And that was that was the part that people had the most trouble with. So that'll be the controversial part that may or may not make the final.
Well, from my perspective, the hard part was getting to where you guys were at. That, for somebody who's a member of the public, like at Ward 3, we'd be sitting then in our board meetings, we're leafing through it, and we're like, what is this?
Yeah.
Bob, what is this here? And Bob, well, and he's trying to explain it, and that, because getting to that point is really helpful, because when people are giving you that feedback, but that if there's ways that we can make it so it's clearer, so getting to that point is easier.
And one of the things I think that there was at one point where Carolyn proposed it, where she showed a map of the city where these things were possible. And then I think after further consideration, it was like, well, as long as the two people on either side can agree.
No, people are confused by it. There was two maps that we did. One map was where the places where you potentially could do new
Right.
and that was relatively small.
Right.
The other is what are the places you could potentially expand your home, and it basically could be
In
anywhere.
URB and URC, it was almost anywhere. So I think we'll have to see what happens with city council at this point, but at this point, it's gone past the planning board, and city council gets to deal with it. So we'll mail things out, but remember, April 15th, no meeting. I think Danielle, you were missed that part, because Wayne and Carolyn and a couple other people won't be here. So that means the next meeting is the first Wednesday in May, and I'm not sure if we'll get city council chambers. Carolyn, I'll talk to her about that. Otherwise, we'll have to find an alternative meeting site.
Reach out to Carol, actually, if you're set a meeting for a long time,
That's what we
save
are.
your meetings way out, because
Yeah.
you can space in advance.
I think she was looking ahead, so
Okay.
it just was tonight. I think there was a CPA meeting. And then Wayne could email me that stuff. Dylan, oh, sorry, you sent out your stuff.
Yeah, this will be really pertinent to the GC, the Green Communities info.
And if anybody has any agenda items for the subsequent meeting, I'll put out a list of agenda items, probably in a week or so, but long before the meeting. Just email the group and let us know what other agenda items. So we're probably like 2 meetings away from actually either setting up some subgroups to go look at particular pieces, or actually starting to really talk about some stuff in substance. So we're getting close.
The other thing you're ever interested in is, we could do a tour, sort of similar to what, we did for slideshow, sort of go to the different,
Good idea.
because we have models of all these different things we were talking about.
Well, I was thinking that some of the subdivisions you were talking about, some of them I know, some of them I don't, can't quite picture.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever actually been through the cluster housing.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure if,
Yeah.
it's probably polite to ask before, a group of 10 of us show up. But, or just walking
We
through.
can just
the
walk it
course.
down the
It
street.
just- I know, it just seems like we should go.
Pointing.
I don't know. But, yeah, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, nice.
Nice things that you
Yeah,
both
tours.
consider, especially when we start looking at cluster.
Yeah.
That I think will be
Yeah.
interesting.
Models, things to avoid.
Yeah. Yeah, so.
And I have a quick question, sort of for future thought, because I don't want to open a big discussion, but I have this burning question about why there is so little bicycle parking downtown. And so when we get around to our parking discussions, maybe if you or somebody, maybe Carolyn, could speak a little bit to.
Bicycles aren't here, so we can just prioritize it.
It's because they took all the parking meters out.
That's right.
That was great.
But the short answer is, because real estate is really interested by downtown. We got a grant from PVTA for 110 bike racks. And it's really been hard to not get strong opposition from merchants for installing.
To what?
There's been strong opposition from merchants in some spots for installing. Some of it's like winter
Can they be
storage.
installed, have you thought about installing them in parking spaces and the merchants are?
People have suggested it, that would certainly be more controversial from from losing a parking space standpoint.
Maybe we could put them where those newspaper boxes are.
Well, the spot that I've lobbied for is actually in front of City Hall, where Main Street's much too wide, and it's actually unsafe. And so you can expand City Hall out. It's also, that might be nice for a park, because people collect there, but it'd be a nice opportunity to sort of, a protest park, and it would actually have a safety benefit for Main Street. And we actually found plans, I have no idea when, but deep in my file cabinet, we found plans from 30 years ago, that like sheet 1 of 8 for narrowing all of Main Street. And unfortunately, we only have sheet 1 of 8. None of us can figure out what study it was part of, but at least I have the one sheet that includes City Hall.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.